Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us from the world. It's really my pleasure to welcome you this morning or afternoon or evening to this webinar event on value addition and processing of critical minerals in Africa. And the big question we're going to try and untangle in this webinar is what would it take for that to happen on the continent. This is not new per se. We've had various waves of resource booms and different endowments across the continent. But this is perhaps, if not one of the first sustained avenues that we have seen African countries collectively trying to come together also on a regional basis to try and push the issue of value addition and processing of these critical minerals. But sometimes it's easier said than done. And what I mean by that is that it's easy to impose export bans, but the real hard work that is needed in terms of the logistics or the financing or the energy and all those other requirements, perhaps, can be a bit lagging. And I've got a fantastic panel here to help us unpack these issues in this webinar. But before I go and let them introduce themselves and we kickstart things, I think it'll be good to, introduce the Critical Minerals Africa Group a little bit more. So basically, we are an industry association, and we bring people together from both industry, from governments, from policymakers. We have academia as well in there to try and push and advance the CRM agenda on the continent and to try and really get all the different stakeholders and the multiple perspectives aligned to drive and help the continent, benefit. We do have a series of events as part of our thought leadership processes, which are upcoming. And please do check the CMAG website. So this is cmagafrica.com. And if you go on there, you see a ton of materials from published research pieces to upcoming events and conferences that you can, subscribe to and join us going forward. Just one small housekeeping rule, and this is really in relation to this webinar. If you have any question that you want to ask, please use the chat function. We're going to do 2 rounds of back and forth with my esteemed panelists, but I'm sure you would have some burning questions that would be at the back of your mind. And so you could use that, and then once we come back after they've had their remarks, we would take that, and then we'll come back and conclude the rest of this webinar. So perhaps maybe let me start with the panelists that we've got with Glen. Glen, I want you to introduce yourself a little bit to us, and then as you introduce yourself as well, sort of maybe help us unpack this issue of value addition and really from where you sit, fundamental question is, what does that really mean for you, number one? And then number two, we do know that there are various deposits of these critical minerals on the continent, but often they are heterogeneous. And how much of the current, call it processing gap, right, is fundamentally a data problem, and where does the issue of geometallurgy, which is your expertise area, fit in? Over.
Wonderful, and thanks for being part of this important discussion. My name is Glen Nwaila, for those that we haven't met. I am an associate professor at University of the Witwatersrand, or Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. And I mainly focus on geometallurgy and machine learning applied to the mining industry. By training, I train on both chemical engineering and geosciences, hence the more interest in more of the process engineering side of things. What I would like to also mention is that At Wits University, I lead a center which is called the African Research Center for Ore System Science, and it's mainly looking into the entire value chain of mining and how we can contribute based on the work that we do in Africa and abroad. And before that, I also used to lead the Wits Mining Institute, which is mainly one of the largest institutes that we have in Africa that mainly deals with mining technology and also critical minerals research in a number of aspects. For the purpose of today, I would like to zoom in further to the aspect of what does value addition looks like in Africa. And the reason for mainly focusing on this is that we do a lot of work in geometallurgy, which we think is quite central to the success of any beneficiation type of initiative. The first thing that I want to say is that value addition in Africa literally looks like a chain, not a slogan. What do I mean by this? I mean, not each and every one of the country should be planning to build a full battery or a metal manufacturing industry on its own. It should mean each and every one of this country or each and every one of the regional powers should actually be working in more of a cooperation type of a manner. And I would like to highlight four core aspects and maybe add two additional more in practical terms on what value addition looks like on our side. The first one is that at a mine site, it means moving beyond exporting key raw materials and firstly understanding the value of what we have. And this is where the value of geometallurgy comes in: characterization, understanding the requirements in terms of energy, in terms of concentration, and also the type of upgrading that we need to do on the raw materials that we mine. That's at the mine site. The second aspect of it is more on an industrial hub level. And to me, industrial hubs are some of the most important things because it simply means each and every country can actually specialize in one or two of the value chain aspects. So the industrial hub level, it means smelting, refining, chemical processing at place. And that actually requires a lot of power, a lot of energy, transportation, reagents, engineering capability to sustain these processes. The third aspect of this is mainly at the manufacturing level, which means selective downstream growth. And by this, I mainly speak of the real advantage. And an example of this is that we don't all have to produce electric vehicles. We can start with things such as battery precursors in countries such as Zambia and the DRC that are quite well endowed with things such as copper and cobalt. And we can also look into cathode materials or alloys. For an example, South Africa used to have a large alloy industry back in the 80s and the 90s, and that industry can actually get another rise as we are discussing this. And then some people are mainly going to play a role, or some countries are going to play a role in providing fertilizers or inputs to fertilizers, stainless steel production, and also PGM-based industrial material. The fourth key aspect of this is mainly at the regional level, which I think this is where we are missing much of an opportunity. And it starts with the way we trade. For an example, if I go to the neighboring country here in South Africa, we have a number of countries that are surrounding us, which is Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, among many others in the SADC region. You will find that each and every country uses its own currency, and that on its own becomes a limitation when it comes to regional level cooperations. So how that looks like, it looks like a distributed value chain where one country mine, the other country concentrate, and the other country may refine, and the other country may manufacture components. To add just two additional ones on this is more on the service level and the knowledge level. We used to produce some of the most basic things, and I'll give an example with steel balls that are used in milling processes in the mine. We now import the bulk of these in countries like India, where else we do have large endowment of steel and manganese in the continent. And this is where more on the service level, we can actually play a key role. African engineers are playing critical roles in countries like Australia, Saudi Arabia, and also going to North America. And again, this speaks to the service level. The last core aspect of this is more on a circular economy level. And this means that we need to understand what we are using and mining, how to recycle them, how to actually create value for them, and how to keep them in the loop circulating far much more longer. And for that particular reason, this is where geometallurgy plays a central role. So I will end by saying the following, that the value addition in Africa should look like converting mineral wealth into industrial capability. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent, Glenn. And I like the sort of 3 or 4 steps that you outlined, from site to industrial hubs to manufacturing, and then the services and knowledge, level. I'll come back to that to you a little bit more to sort of push you a little hard on that and ask a question of what would it take. But let me stick with Mark and from sort of where you sit, as a geologist, having advised, on various mining projects at different stages. How often do these critical mineral projects on the continent kind of reach pre-feasibility and even the feasibility stage before the bankers come in? And what are the sort of typical failure points that you see, and how do we sort of address it? Over.
Thank you, Theo, and to the rest of my panelists. I think Professor Nwaila has been looking over my shoulder because a lot of the discussion points he's already addressed. That being said, so Theo, thank you. Yes, as you said, I'm a geologist. I have worked extensively in Africa for the majority of my career. Like Professor Nwaila, I'm a Wits graduate. I just haven't got the PhD yet, so you can't call me doctor, unfortunately. Though, I guess to get really back to the point, Africa, as we all know, has been colonized and its mineral wealth has been exploited for several hundred years, going back to the Portuguese. I think they were the longest colonizers, over 400 years in Mozambique and Angola, if I remember correctly. But moving on from that is, it's really understanding the difference also between value and wealth, or value and worth. A lot of times people sort of tend to get the two concepts mixed up when, financiers are actually talking worth or wealth, money terms, and return on net value and investment, where everybody else is talking about value, which is a lot of the intangible stuff, relative importance, usefulness. What is the society as a whole going to get? Now, in terms of money being spent in Africa, and it's like most of the world, the go-to metal has always been gold. It's probably cost per dollar is the cheapest one to find. It tends to occur in almost every single country in the world. Someone somewhere has gold. Obviously now with the move to net zero, there's been a shift in focus to looking at other minerals. So we all know about cobalt and copper. They tend to be the ones everybody talks about because of the concentration in Zambia and in the DRC. Lithium is also coming back into play as well. A lot of countries and continents have lithium. But overall, and to reinforce what Professor Nwaila was saying, it's all very well and good to dig up the rock, but the real value, to use the common expression, is in the downstream. It's in the processing, beneficiation, making sure that all the value is extracted. So not just the primary metal. So lithium, for example, there tends to be co byproducts. A lot of those times they get discarded. They're just lying there, causing environmental degradation potentially over the longer term. But that is then building up the intrinsic value of the continent. So, downstream manufacturing, moving into high tech. And each country, and again, as I said, this is where Professor Nwaila and I are fully in agreement. Not everyone is going to be able to produce batteries or computers. I mean, each country should play to its worth. And that gets back to something which I think is a really intrinsic point that tends not to get discussed too often, is education and driving the value add in terms of that. Most countries, if you have a high education level, if you look at China, India, Singapore, Malaysia, they all focused on primary education, the STEM subjects, and driving that value add, and rather having those people staying in country than having a brain drain, then moving out of country to North America, to Australia, where that value is actually going to someone else. It is not staying back in the continent and is not driving or adding to the value of the continent, where the skills are there and the skills don't need to be imported from Canada or Australia or America or the UK.
Amazing, amazing, Mark. And I like the last bit you finished on the education and then the STEM bit, which I think ties in nicely to what Glenn also mentioned in this last point, because sometimes that's often sort of overlooked. And maybe I'll again come back to you second round to push you a little on that point around education and the STEM bit and how do we get these tripartite industry, academia, and then government going in terms of the funding that is needed to get your research going and create the intellectual property and whatnot that actually drives that innovation ecosystem. Because at the end of the day, as they say, resources are not, they become. And I would come to you, David, to also get your perspectives. You're the money man here amongst us, and we want to sort of hear really sort of from where you sit, again, having advised on these projects and then closed a few of that, often we do hear value addition being discussed in policy terms and policy circles, but ultimately it's the financiers that decides which projects get, closed and built and then ultimately value extracted. So I wonder, can you tell us a little bit, from the deal structures that you're seeing coming across your desk, is there a genuine appetite for financing, within country or regional processing and beneficiation projects on the continent? What are the pain points and how are you helping to address that? Over.
Thanks, Theo, and thanks for being part of the panel. My name is David Rhodes. I'm the Managing Director of Endeavour Financial. We finance projects, development, expansion projects around the world. So our big part of our business is Africa, and I've been in Africa for over 25 years financing mines of various metals. And as Mark says, obviously gold is easy, but there's plenty of other metals in Africa, and obviously the copper is one of the big drivers as well that we see in Africa, as well as the critical metals coming out of countries. On the finance side, I think there's two aspects I look at it. Downstream, if you're talking critical metals, you need billions of dollars to build a processing plant. We're not talking, just a bit of sorting of ore to get it upgraded. If you're going to battery metals, you're going to magnets, those types of aspects. This is billion-dollar type processing facilities. And not only is the money you need, they need constant feed source coming into these refineries, these plants. And that's just not one mine. Anybody who's going to spend $1 billion needs multi-access to many mines, multi-access to a lot of the material to constantly feed their mine. They need to blend it. They need to make sure their refinery is then, as it's a highly chemically, and I think a hydromet, and you can see I'm not a technical person, hydromet and pyromet, there's different systems they use in which to extract and obviously refine the product into the final metal. And often that is not the final metal. That could be a sulfate, whatever. Then that is something which is sold to the end user. So my view is there's a lot of money required to build a plant. You need a lot of mines to feed it. And additionally, that plant needs, three major things, in my view. The cheapest power you can get. You've got to have cheap power. You've got to have good infrastructure. You've got to have access to usually a lot of water, my understanding. And then also you need a lot of chemicals. So you need a good access to all of those things. So there's a logistics part to all of this. And you've got to remember the world is global. As long as you can get your product on a ship, it can go anywhere in that aspect. So Africa is in competition with the rest of the world. And obviously we know China has already taken the critical metals market and owns it. So you've got a very powerful party who's probably produces 90% of the critical metals, if we're talking specifically about them. So you've got a hell of a, to be blunt, sorry to say that, but you've got a tough bit of competition if you're trying to set up a new refinery, which may cost you billions. It's got to make sure it's low cost on the power, has all the sources to the chemicals, all the sources of the water and good infrastructure to be able to cope with and be competitive in that world. So economics-wise, it's pretty tough. You need all of those factors, and you need to make a return for your investors. And it's not just a couple of $100 million; it's a couple of billion you need.
Okay, so let me stick with you, David, again, and then maybe to press further. So, kind of, have you seen a few projects come to your desk that are sort of ticking these boxes in terms of the power, the infrastructure with water, and then also the chemicals bit, and then sort of from a financing or even call it a policy angle, how can we help to de-risk these things such that the cost of capital becomes lower and ultimately delivers value to the stakeholders across that ecosystem?
It's a tough question to answer because all we've ever seen really is copper smelters, really, because you go to Zambia, you go to DRC, there's lots of copper. So putting a copper smelter in, but that doesn't add a huge amount of, I think the guys on panel agree, that doesn't add a huge amount. You're really taking a concentrate into a metal. It's not a huge value add. Yes, it's important because you can export the metal or use the metal yourself, but it's not a huge value add as you get with critical metals, where there are 10 or 20 times, even more in some cases of metals. Processing of that adds so much more value in that sense. I think the main problem is we do see opportunities, but in reality, when we look at them, there's always a piece missing. It might be one mine trying to then upsize and process. In reality, we know from looking at other processing around the world, you can't really just do it with one mine. You need other mines to be able to feed it. And then there may be power, but then you've got to be the chemicals aren't produced in Africa. They need to be imported in. There's logistics and costs of that. So there is also the will of the government to provide economic support. Yes, Mark talked about training and education, which is always the vital point. It's really also a taxation. These are long-term businesses. If you're spending billions, it's not a 5-year payback. It could be a 10, 15-year payback on these investors. So it needs long-term government support in all aspects of developing that type of refinery or that type of processing plant necessary. So we don't see that at all in my business. We don't see all the boxes being ticked. We want to, but you need every box ticked, and that's the difficulty that I see when looking at financing these processing plants.
Okay, brilliant. And I think the important point you make is that you need a lot of policy push and support behind it. Put our money's where our mouth is. In that sense.
Yeah. Otherwise, put it on a boat and off it goes. I mean, that's, and I know someone mentioned you don't make as much money. The companies make money putting on a boat and selling it overseas. Yes, there's a huge value uplift they could get by building a processing plant, but that's billions of dollars. It's a totally different expertise to doing mining and processing into a concentrate or processing into a doré bar, for example, or into a sulfate or something of that nature. There's a huge difference, and that takes a different mentality, a different long-term view. As I say, it's more of a 10 to 15-year payback period. So that's where you need, true policy, true, a kind of a continent view. And then you need to decide where you're going to build the refinery processing plant. And I'm sure every country will put their hand up and say they want it to have it in their backyard, for the jobs, for the GDP growth, et cetera, et cetera. So you have that whole policy decision to be made.
Brilliant. Okay, so good point made. And then the political economy dynamics. I kind of want to pivot a bit, come to you, Mark, again on that sort of same point, and to tie into the earlier point that you raised about the education and then the STEM bit. These minerals, whether they're lithium or cobalt or nickel or manganese, all have very distinct kind of processing challenges, right? And I'm wondering, in terms of the processing pathways, sometimes some of them are maybe underappreciated, and I want you to kind of throw a little bit of light around that and what that fundamentally means for project feasibility and financial closure. And then the second aspect really being the skills or the STEM question, which I would want you to kind of give us a bit of color or further color on.
Sure, Theo. Though I would argue that seeing as Professor Nwaila is in the geometallurgy and processing field, he would probably be better. So anything that I say now, Glen, please feel free to interrupt, or when it comes to your turn to say Mark is talking rubbish and this is actually the technical excellence that you need. But I think probably to lead on, one of the things to lead on is from David's point, infrastructure and energy and long-termism, clarity and certainty are all critical things that need to build any industry. Now, it's a book I'm going to punt. I have no dog in the show, but a chap called Dan Wang wrote a book late last year, early this year, called Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. And he talks about a lot of these aspects. Why has China got to where they got to? And a lot of it is based on long-term planning, understanding that these things, you can't just pull the plug overnight, is not due to a political manifesto. So, for example, which a lot of people forget or don't know, rare earths are pretty tricky they're not rare. It's just that's a historical hangover. They're just difficult to process and get the stuff out, and they're carcinogenic and reprotoxic and a whole lot of other nasty things, but we need them. But China started looking at those back in the 1980s and created research institutes to try and understand them. The similar way lithium, which is everybody wants it nowadays, China started looking at lithium and made it a government priority for long-term understanding lithium projects, understanding how you process back in the 1970s. So there's been long-term processes coming through all of these. In terms of, again, the long-term educational thing, we start looking, and one of the questions is about Indonesia comparison. Even though there's political change, there's long-term national level programs for technical skills to understand what is needed, making sure that the general population as a whole understands that, okay, you want a refinery, you want to upgrade, these are long-term things. It's not going to be a switch we can trigger with the next election. There are going to be sacrifices that had to be made. For example, there's a really nice case study about Nigeria spending billions of US dollars, I think, from the World Bank, and then the local population turning around and refusing to actually pay for the infrastructure upgrades that they wanted. Getting back to what David was talking about, just networking in Africa. When I was in Johannesburg, it was often easier for me to fly to London or to Frankfurt or to Paris and then fly back again than it was to actually just try and get a flight from Johannesburg to wherever I wanted to go to. In fact, most of the international flights, as you would know, Johannesburg, Accra, and the only reason that leg exists is because people are going to the United States. There's no, if there was no reason to fly to America, there was no reason for most flights to land in Accra. So again, infrastructure, transporting, regional stuff, and again, what historical hangovers, railway gauges are just not the same size between countries, because Portugal had their own railway standard gauge, Britain had the two. When you got to the border, you had to go and pull everything off and dump it, which is why trucking became the choice way of doing things, because it was just easier and effectively cheaper to use trucks, and it would be to use railway lines, which is in and of itself just doesn't actually make logical sense. The same way with freighting and porting. A lot of focus because people are exporting raw material and not processed material. So you have the development of these large deep water bulk harbors. I mean, Togo and Lomé have now, I think they're now the third largest freighting port in Africa. And again, that's just because government put in measures in place, so it became cheaper to go there. Therefore, people are now moving from Togo, moving to Togo, and the same is happening. And there's obviously, as Glen, both gentlemen have alluded to, regional strengths as well, which moving on to the larger picture instead of being aspirational, is to sit down at an AU forum and say, well, what does each region do well, and to try and work for the better of Africa and say, well, in North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, we've got massive phosphate deposits. How can we use those to benefit? And if we're looking at a purely African type of concept, how can we use that to benefit Africa as a whole and rather just Morocco? But again, we're now getting into stuff which is gets into politics and national identities and things which tend to be a little bit harder to negotiate when you're flying your country's flag and you want the Black Stars to win the football and no one else.
Yeah, interesting analogy you finish. I think, yeah, we've got to sort of move from just Black stars to talking about African stars, more or less, if we want this to work on a regional basis in that respect. And I think it's a very important point you make also, really the value of long-term planning. You cannot just wish these things right into being. If you've got to do it, then it's got to be done well. And you need to have all the alignment between industry and then between the financing side, and also even the research, side of things. And I'm gonna come back to you, Glenn, also to get your reflections on this. And then, when you made your initial remarks, you did mention these sort of 4 points around the site, the hubs, the manufacturing, and then the sort of services. But to sort of maybe push a little deeper around the issue of or the use of machine learning and what you're doing. I mean, to what extent, if any, right, is that helping in terms of the process optimization, or even sort of the improving the economics of the processing of these critical mineral resources? I wonder if you could share some reflections on that, and then any of the other points that either David or Mark has said.
Wonderful. I think I will start with the points that others have said, and then I can move to the details of what are some of the things we are doing in the artificial intelligence space. The first thing that I want to say is, over the duration of mining in Africa for the last more than 100 years, the governments have behaved in ways that they were not supposed to behave, but mining companies have equally done exactly the same. So we're actually at a stage where no one trusts the other party. And if you are an economist, you will know of Michael A. Spence, who's known for the theory of signaling. And what he has actually said is that if you are known to be a crook or somebody who cannot be trustworthy, in order for you to convince people that you have changed, you have to do things that no one can ever imagine you can do. And I think we are at this current moment now where the African governments have to convince investors that their investments are safe. But at the same time, the investors have to assure communities that there will be benefits that are going to lead to structural development in different countries. And why am I saying all this? It starts with one. If you look at R&D expenditure in Africa, it's actually quite low. It's actually less than 1% as a continent as a whole. Whereas if you look at countries like China that Mark has been citing, it's far much above what Africa is investing when it comes to R&D, research and development. And the United States of America is even far much higher than what Africa is putting into the talent pipeline. So we are now at a stage where we are saying we need new technology, but there has been no investment in our training institutions, be it universities or technical colleges. And for that particular reason, it means we are starting slightly behind compared to our peers. But let's now fast forward it to say that we are living in an age of big data, and this is where AI comes in. And where are we currently using this? We're actually using it in 4 key aspects. It looks like today I will mainly be giving 4 examples. The first one is in mineral prospectivity mapping before we even get into processing. So the smartest agents that we have at the moment that everyone knows of is self-driving cars. But those agents, the same fundamental theory and investment that has been made is now being translated into techniques to advance how we decide where to drill and how to discover mineral deposits more responsibly. So that's the first place where we are using a lot of AI. The second aspect of it, which has been an issue for a number of years, is how do we fast-track development of mines? And what has actually happened, not in all jurisdictions or many attempts that are happening in a number of African sites, is to ensure the introduction of autonomous technology for both development of mine or actually mining itself in regions that traditionally we used to mine using conventional methods. The third aspect, which is the core of the issue that we're discussing today, is in what I call smart metallurgy. And in smart metallurgy is mainly process optimization, where before we used to run thousands or millions of test work for us to know how to recover platinum, nickel, and how to optimize that process. But using big data analytics and collection of knowledge that has been gathered for a number of years, we can now actually decide and design more of a plant type of schematic or optimization of the process by just running a number of simulations in a computer, which is far much easier compared to running a number of experiments. The second aspect of it is also designing the sequencing of infrastructure and instrumentation for recovery of minerals. So back then, the only mobile plant that you will find was something for iron ore or for gold in the form of mobile equipment, whereas nowadays it's quite easy to mobilize one plant infrastructure from one place to the other. And I've actually seen this in a number of commodities that is happening in Africa, that when we close one complex, we can just mobilize the infrastructure to the next side. The key challenge, unlike mining, where you can negotiate with things such as electricity and power, you can switch them on and off. When it comes to processing, it's not something that you can stop the process while it's ongoing. So we cannot speak of innovation on that without speaking of sustainable and continuous energy production that goes into these particular systems, because that affects the product quality. And we have seen a major impact of this, mainly in the SADC region, where we used to have a high volume of plant assembly site where we're actually assembling cars. And in the last 5 years, we have seen significant number of car production sites shutting down. The second aspect of it, we also use to produce things such as roof balls, which are used for supporting of places where we mine. And we have also seen such factories actually shutting down because of energy aspects. And then the last aspect that I also wanted to touch on is how do we move beyond just processing within a particular country to a value in terms of systems. And I think this is where we need a stronger vision, which is coordinated within the continent, but a vision needs to be backed up by funding. If you look at all the African mines, you will notice that the ownership hardly belongs to Africans. And for that particular reason, it's actually a misnomer to expect beneficiation to be done by people who are investing from other continents, because their primary responsibility is their own continents. And I think this is where those who are in finance can start looking into things such as the African pension funds to say that can we work in the same model that China and Singapore has actually used to develop their industries, by also investing our own money in the processes that we are advocating. And then the last aspect that I wanted to mention on this is the skill sets. If I was to ask here, there is about 84 people in this particular call at the moment. If I was to ask how many of them have direct experience in working in a battery assembly plant, I'll be very surprised if more than 10% of them in this particular call have actually participated directly into that. And that speaks to the issue of exposure, the type of education that we're actually providing our graduates in our universities. And this is where multi-party collaborations between the East and the Western countries in terms of skills exchange and the universities becoming more central in making sure that people do have hands-on experience on the things that we're talking about, as opposed to a textbook knowledge. Thank you.
Right. Okay. That's very, very interesting, Glenn. Let me ask you just one question. I'm going to put you on the spot here. So you talk all the nice stuff, and I know you're doing a lot of work, especially around the machine learning and the AI stuff. You talk about prospectivity mapping, fast track mine development, smart metallurgy, and then whatnot. Have you had any of our governments come to your department or industry and say, hey, I've got $1 million here or 5 million. I want to use that to support the work that you're doing?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. So we have had at the different levels of involvement. So we had mining companies, and I will use a simple example. Sibanye-Stillwater, which is now a multinational mining company, is one of the key funders of innovation work that we're doing at Wits University. They even have a laboratory there, which is called Digital Mining Lab, and where we have a mock mine where we're training people. And that shows you there are some of the mining companies that are willing to do this. In terms of the governments, the South African government, of course, have consulted us when they had to formulate the critical minerals strategy list. And we have also worked with the government of Zambia to some extent, and some of the individuals coming from Ghana. But the bulk of the people who are actually consulting us, you will be surprised that it's mainly the US and the European countries compared to the African countries.
That's okay. I'll stop here. But I think it sort of shows also the nature of the problem that we're dealing with here. I think, again, having sort of been in this space for quite a bit of time now, you see a bit of the mismatch between the policy rhetoric, right, and then sort of the delivery on the ground across all the bits that is needed, whether it's education or whether it's financing or whether it's trying to help sort of de-risk these value chains. Thank you very much for that. Let me come to the questions that we have. We've got quite a number. Please keep them coming. We still have another 25 minutes to go, but I have a question here from Oli Lee, and I think perhaps, David, you could try answer this for us. I mean, he was saying that, or she perhaps saying that, Indonesia is often cited as an example of how more controversial instruments like export restrictions have been leveraged to boost raw material processing and then also increase midstream to downstream linkages. What are some of the lessons from the Indonesian experience for Africa? Are there any similarities? Are there any differences? How do we sort of take that forward, David?
I think, obviously putting restrictions in place is a good way to make sure, obviously, the raw material stays in the country, but you need the next phase. You can't then say, okay, mining company, you build a refinery. As we heard from the other people on the panel, obviously it takes 4 to 5 years to build something, and you've got permissions, etc. So if you are going to say in the future, okay, in 10 years' time, I want all the, say, copper or the nickel, obviously nickel's the big thing in Indonesia, I want that to be processed to a certain level, then you've got to give people warning. You've got to give them the permissions, you've got to give them the approvals, you've got to give them the support of a long-term stability agreement or long-term investment agreement to spend that billion or so dollars to retain it within the country. Then you've got to allow them to export that product, not to say, oh, now I need it to be sold to X, Y, and Z. So yes, I'm very supportive from a financing point of view of keeping as much wealth within the country. It is their asset that's being developed by in this case, in Africa, mainly foreign companies. Very understandable why they like to keep as much value for GDP growth, for their own country's growth. But you need a long-term plan. I mean, for example, you hear now and again some countries go, okay, you can't export this product. And I'm going, great, but there's actually nowhere to refine it in your country. So, and you can't build a refinery within, as I say, the next minute. So, yes, certainly a very blunt form of tool, but it needs a lot more long-term planning than just saying, okay, you can't export your lithium ore now when there's no refineries in the country. But Indonesia does do that for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's driven its processing side to the nickel business in the country. Secondly, it also uses it to increase the price of nickel on a global basis. So there's 2 factors it does it. One is price protection, the other one is driving that business. But they've got a longer term plan in place in Indonesia, which they do execute quite well.
Okay, so price and then the longer term plan. I have another question here. Mark, maybe you can help answer this. Actually, I'll tie 2 questions into one. One from Emmanuel Amoadakwa, and then another one from Connor Glanville. And I think both of them basically are saying, look, we have China literally dominating quite a lot of these value chains. And more or less, they have built an embedded infrastructural or technological advantage, in addition to access to, market and capital. So really, to what extent are Africa's value addition frameworks to that extent structurally constrained, regardless of what we're going to do here, or attempting to do in this regard? Is there any opportunity somewhat for us to still move up the value chain, or in very simple terms, we should just forget about it?
Again, like the question thrown to Dave, it's not necessarily a very easy answer. A lot of these type of things are really getting into national policy making and how national policy is expedited. So again, let's use the example of stopping exports. Indonesia had a long-term plan. Short term, they actually saw capital going to other countries like the Philippines, where there was investment. Zimbabwe, I think, is probably the classic example of export bans on lithium raw material. All that's pretty much done is China still controls it, and they're just doing a partial product, and that material is still getting exported. So we get back to national policy, long-termism, and making sure that everybody understands these are not things that you can just flip on after you've won the next election. It takes time and planning. You need to get the legislation in place. As Glen alluded to, mining companies need to show that they are voluntarily going to start, financing people. Like Sibanye does it really well, uplifting students, providing students with education, supporting local universities, creating research hubs. But it is, regardless of how we want to cut the cake, Africa's coming from a relatively low base because of lack of investment. The United Nations is trying to do a great job with the Timbuktu Mine Tech Hub in Zambia, but again, they're starting from effectively zero. A lot of the stuff, if you look, that they're investing in is the next quantum leap. So they're looking at drone technology, machine learning and stuff. Is really the stuff that Dave's alluded to, the long-term capital intensive. You can't just turn on and off. Those things need to be sat down, thought about. And as we've been discussing in the earlier points of the conversation, it's all very, very well and good to have all these aspirations, but there's still the wicked questions exist. Power, cost, rule of government, rule of law, water offtakes, environmental impact. So there's a lot of other things which I don't think there's any quick answers to. They need to be sat down and thought out with much longer term strategies coming through. Again, I get back to the Chinese example. Lithium, they started thinking about in the 1970s. Rare earths, they were starting to think about and plan for in the 1980s. We're now sitting in 2026. These are long-term things. So I think the easiest answers is, where can things go? Which are the most advanced industrial nations? Well, South Africa obviously being one of them. Then you start looking at Namibia, Morocco, Egypt. What can those countries do? What can they do with the infrastructure? And then it may be the type of, and again, I speak out of turn because these are political decisions. Countries like, for example, Chad will then export its raw materials under some sort of terms and agreements to Nigeria for processing. And there's some sort of bilateral trade through ECOWAS or some sort of interregional organization, which will make sure that there's free and fair and equitable investment and transfer of value and wealth to each part of those economies. I mean, we've seen what's happened in West Africa with Niger, or the Nigerian government feeling that with all the mining for uranium that's happened over the decades, and they've now nationalized the biggest uranium asset because they feel they were not getting either the value or the wealth returns that they felt was required. We've seen it in Mali and we've seen it in Burkina Faso, but those are obviously gold operations. But though that is the extreme side if a country doesn't see or feel that they're getting the value add, both in terms of GDP, money for the state, as well as uplift of the local population.
Right. Okay. I think I would sort of throw the same question to to Glen and then David also, because I see your hand up. But it's similar to sort of the questions that I see here in the Q&A bank here. I mean, for example, Madalena also raises the same, call it structural barriers. And are we sort of between the ambition and then the realism? How do we sort of strike kind of that balance? So Glenn, to you, and then I'll come to you, David.
I think for me, the starting point will be to understand what we have, because at the moment, there's too many speculations on each and every country. Everyone in Africa claims to be having particular minerals and endowment and particular policy instruments. And I think we need to first consolidate all our policy instruments and linking them with the endowments that we have in different regions. That's the starting point. The second aspect that I want to touch before I go to the main point is the issue of export bans only works more on a short-term basis. It's not something that you can use in a long term to actually attract investment, because you need to back that up with something else, with either a policy that is going to ensure development happens within that particular country or that particular region, or there is something that is so uniquely positioned in your own country that they have no other option but to come to you only. So what Zimbabwe has done here, as an example, can only work for a maximum of about 5 years if you do focus on that. Afterwards, the policy instrument from their own country have to show up to change how things have to be done and designed. And then the core aspect that I wanted to speak of is the issue of having a coordinated, more of, you can call them regional hubs or district types of hubs, where we know that if we are looking for something, this is the region that we need to go to. Because at the moment, what we have is we have South Africa still speaking about its old industrial complex. But if you look in the last number of years, there has been a lot of changes or things that are not really attracting investors, including the policy instruments themselves. You go to a country like Botswana, which was quite known for many years for diamond mining. And the moment that the synthetic diamonds came into the market, it simply means that they have to be proactively looking into metals. So that also speaks to the policy that the country advertised itself as having in its position. So the core aspect that I want to say is mainly to say that to minimize the barriers that leads to much of the investments, the starting point is to have policies that can assure investors that over a long term, their investments are going to be safe, and starts by understanding what you have and what is the value of what you are promising people that you have. The second aspect of it is the aspect of infrastructure, which we tend to overlook, because this was also mentioned by one of the persons here on the question and answer session. If I need to go to a mine here in South Africa, I can just drive my car. But if I want to go to a mine in Guinea, I have to fly via Mali. And from there on, I need to get again another private plane to go into a different site. And that actually leads to investors having more leverage in negotiating versus what the country offers, in a sense of saying that they are now promising to build you a road, which was supposed to be the responsibility of the government. And then the last core aspect of this is the funding mechanism that I have mentioned, the instruments for funding this. We have so much money that is sitting in different instruments in a form of pensions, in the form of banks, in a form of investments. But still, whenever we speak of investments in Africa, we're actually speaking of foreign direct investments. But that comes with terms and conditions. And we have seen it. There is work that we have been doing where we have seen this happening in a number of countries, where things such as the green energy transitions, countries are taking loans, but without backing them up with the implementation plan. So it goes back again to say, do we have a plan in place for the things that we're actually saying we are looking for? And do we have people who are capable of implementation?
Thank you. So plan and people. David, I'm going to give the last slot to you. And in trying to sort of address that, maybe just talk a little bit also about the institutional capital. So Glen mentioned pension funds and some of these other instruments that we could leverage. Could you also help expand on that in addition to other points that you wanted to mention?
Sure, it was good to hear people saying, why don't the pension funds, etc., invest in these kind of processes? And to be blunt, they don't. You know, we look at capital, take South Africa as an example, quite a few people in South Africa on the call. Their pension funds don't invest in small mining stocks. They don't invest in developing those types of institutions. It's not in their remit. It's not their pension funds. They invest for 20, 30-year return for their pension funds, not looking at small returns. So they do not invest. And you could say they should do, because South African money should be reinvested. But it's actually not government money. It's the people's money. I'm sure no one on this call would like their pension to be, lost because they invested in a, small mining venture somewhere X, Y, and Z. So whilst it is difficult to say, okay, there's a lot of pension funds, it's more really the sovereign wealth funds, the country's own money, which they could reinvest and drive this industry and to drive the downstream parts. But the problem we have, and this is where I'm talking kind of global politics, because we are now doing a lot of business with the US. President Trump has said, drill, drill, drill. He's got this critical metals push going on from the US, which is expanding across the world. You see it now. He wants to set up a store of every critical metal. So a vault is called. A vault of every critical metal. So there is billions of dollars being spent, and we are managing some of it from US Exim and the DFC, the US funders, where they are trying to basically own, by lending money, critical metals for that part of for the US, to basically, and they're very open about it, to stop the monopoly that the Chinese have. One of the problems with Africa, and I'm going a bit more political, that the Chinese have lent Africa $180 billion since the year 2000. The Chinese have said they're going to spend another $50 billion funding Africa. How do you think one of your major funding parties would think if you started trying to compete against their critical metals processing divisions, where they have 90% of the business? So there's a massive political shift here that needs to go and be discussed with the major funder to Africa, China, saying, hey guys, I know you control the market, but do you mind if we do a bit of processing as well and a bit of refining as well? So I think there's a big, to be honest, to try and beat China in the processing of critical metals, I think you need the whole of Africa to join together to have any chance of actually developing, a business or like a critical metals business that can compete with China. It's really tough. It's not just one country or two countries. The whole of Africa needs to get together. And obviously Africa is a very diverse place from north to south. So it's not an easy one to fix at this point. But China is dominant. China sadly has lent Africa a lot of money and is still lending a lot of money. So that's one of the biggest issues, I think, is a big political issue.
Okay, brilliant. I think we could go on, but unfortunately we've just, come up to the hour mark, and we need to wrap up. But it's been a fantastic time having the three of you, Glen, Mark, David, to share your perspective on the issue of value addition and processing. And if I'm just to summarize all the things that kind of has been shared, including the comments that have been shared from the Q&A, I probably will put it in four things or four acronyms. The politics, or rather the geopolitics, the policies that are needed to drive this at a country and then also at a regional level. The fourth P being the people. So the STEM, the skills, the things to do with, the machine learning and then the AI and then all of that. And then maybe the fourth P here being the processes as well. So for example, what you need to do to try and get capital to address the issues of the logistics of the electricity and water and then all of that. And if we can perhaps align on these four things, then we would be talking about, increasing the value share of these critical mineral endowments on the continent. I'd like to thank you all very much, and to also thank you for making time to join us, our participants. Our next webinar will be communicated in due course, but please do make time to visit the CMAG website. We do have a lot of resources and materials on there, and then you can also subscribe to our newsletter where you can get the regular summaries that we send across. But I want to take the opportunity to thank you for coming. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, David. And we'll see you again on the next webinar. Over.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.